Today's guest is someone who sits right at the intersection of lived experience and science in open water swimming. Dr Angela Spence is a marathon swimmer, an exercise physiologist, and a cardiovascular researcher who has spent her career studying how the heart, lungs, and blood vessels adapt to different types of exercise. Ange completed a solo Rottnest Channel swim in 2014, RCS 1443, and has been involved in multiple team and duo crossings, as well as acting as support crew for other swimmers. So she's seen the sport from just about every angle, in the water and on the boat. Academically, Ange completed her training at the University of Western Australia, including a first-class honours project and a PhD in cardiovascular and exercise physiology. Her doctoral research challenged existing ideas about how the heart and arteries adapt to long-term endurance and resistance training, and her work was recognised with multiple awards, including the ESSA Medal for the most outstanding PhD thesis in exercise and sports science. Ange is now a senior lecturer at Curtin University in the School of Allied Health, where she teaches and coordinates core exercise physiology units. Over the past few years, Ange and I have reconnected through our shared interest in open water swimming research, particularly around swimming-induced pulmonary edema, or SIPE, as well as the cardiovascular, respiratory, and thermoregulatory demands of marathon swimming. In today's conversation, we're going to focus on what happens to the heart and lungs during long open water swims, and why conditions like SIPE and hypothermia matter, and what swimmers and support crew should understand to make better decisions in the water. Ange, thanks for joining us today. For listeners who don't know who you are yet, what's your connection to open water and marathon swimming?
Well, thanks for having me. It's good to be here. My experience starts probably from the early 2000s. As you can hear from my accent, I'm not originally from Australia, I'm from South Africa. And I came over in the early 2000s to start uni. I was doing an exercise and sports science degree at the University of Western Australia, as you know. And some of my uni peers said, hey, there's this swim thing to Rottnest Island. Would you be keen? And I thought, oh, that sounds like a pretty cool idea, but also crazy that people are swimming to Rottnest. I had experience as a swimmer when I was a kid. Just before I was a teenager, I was quite competitive. I was swimming in provincial training squads, so I guess that's kind of similar to state level. I didn't compete at a state or provincial level. And I think it just became a bit too much. There was changing priorities at school and so on. And my physical self started changing as well. And so I did step away from swimming. But it wasn't until my early 20s that I came back to it and I really loved it. I also, as you know, did a solo crossing, my first and only solo crossing, the Rottnest Channel swim in 2014. And that one came about after watching and being part of a support crew for a really close friend. And I thought, maybe I could do this as well. I had seen them training and sort of the commitment that it took. And so then I also did some training, probably 2 years in preparation for a solo. So an entire year of training and then a duo swim and then another full year and then a solo swim.
I think just from the conversations I've had so far, there's a lot of similarities with that background and going, this sounds really interesting. I'd really like to be part of it, doing the team, being part of a team, whether it be support crew, and then progressing into that solo. You've obviously been on both sides of the boat, and now from a research perspective, how has that experience shaped how you see the sport now?
Yeah, I think I've done just about every support role that there probably is. I've, as you say, been boat support crew. I've been there at 5 a.m. dropping off crews and kayaks at the beach. I've paddled as well. That's probably the hardest of all of the tasks, I will say that. And a couple of years ago, I even skippered for my partner who did a solo crossing. So I do know the events quite well. I do know the crossing, the sort of logistics required. And so I think now as a researcher who's also got projects in this area, I think one of the biggest perspectives that I can probably bring is empathy. So I think I can relate a little bit better to what it actually feels like when you are training for and prepping for an event. It's huge and I think it's just all consuming, at least it was in my experience. I also think I can probably bring a bit more of an understanding about bridging the gap between what's happening on paper with your training. You know, people are sometimes training upwards of 30, 40 Ks a week. What does that actually look like and what does that actually feel like? And then I think from my experience as a physiologist, I probably have a better appreciation for some of the normal physiological adaptations or responses that people are going to be feeling, and maybe not over pathologizing some of those responses. And I hope that I can use some of my skills and my experience to bridge the gap that we have through science, and hopefully be able to ask some of the right questions in some of the projects that we have ongoing at the moment.
Yeah, so building on that, I'd like to go back a little bit and talk about the research you've done prior to moving more into the swimming space. So you did your honours and PhD initially with ergogenic aids, and then moved into the cardiovascular and the vascular adaptation. What fascinated you about the heart and the blood vessels?
To be honest, it was opportunistic at the time, I think. It was an opportunity to pick a project or pick a topic that I think was really interesting, and I could go a little bit deeper and really challenge my physiological understanding all over the systems and the processes that are happening in the body. And I think the cardiovascular system, and I'm probably going to be biased now, but the cardiovascular system is probably one of the most interesting because it's so complex and it's so interrelated with so many of the other systems. And if we think about exercise, and I like to think of myself as an exercise physiologist or an integrative exercise physiologist, the cardiovascular aspect was probably one that drew me to it more so than some of the other topics that we have in physiology. In saying that, I just have a general curiosity for the body and for physiology and for science. And so any topic I think is of interest, and that's probably what's landed me in some marathon swimming research as well along the way.
So if I was to ask you then about that PhD itself
Yeah.
and your interest in that space, your PhD challenged some long held assumptions about how the heart and lungs adapt to different types of training.
Yeah.
Could you just, maybe in simple terms, give a bit of a background into what you explored and what you found about these different activities?
Yeah, so I guess one of the ways in which we understand how the heart and blood vessels adapt to long-term exercise is by using imaging techniques. And one of the key imaging tools that we have is something called echocardiography. So it's like ultrasound. It's the same technology that we use to image babies in the womb. And it's very safe. And there's a lot of data that's supporting how the heart adapts using this technology. One of the limitations of this technology, though, at least at the time when I was doing my PhD a few years ago now, was that it was very limited to two-dimension. So when you think of the heart, it's a three-dimensional organ that's in the chest cavity, and it's going to adapt in different ways. It's going to get bigger when we exercise. That's a normal physiological response. But we can't really measure that very well when we're measuring it in 2D. So we have to make some geometric assumptions about what that three-dimensional organ looks like. And so one of the imaging tools that we used as part of my PhD studies was cardiac MRI. So it's a little bit better at trying to quantify the size of the heart, particularly the ventricles. And the other aspect that we were quite interested in is that different kinds of exercise were supposedly or have been hypothesized to have a different cardiovascular adaptive response. So if we think about exercise on a spectrum, on one end we might have purely endurance-based exercise, so things like running or cycling, and then on the other end of that spectrum we might have resistance exercise, and that might be something like weightlifting or resistance exercise training. And so we actually trained people for 6 months with these two different exercise modes and compared them. And what we found challenged, as you say, challenged some of the assumptions and some of the knowledge that we thought that we had in exercise physiology about how the heart adapts to those types of exercise.
So you mentioned the last part there just about the different types of exercise and how, from an aerobic perspective, the heart adapts a little bit differently to more strength-based. At what point did you start to see that overlap into that cardiovascular research into the open water marathon type swimming?
Yeah, well, I think marathon swimming is, or open water swimming, swimming in general, is really different in terms of an endurance sport when we think of those classical endurance sports like running or cycling. Those are predominantly bipedal, so we're on our legs, lower limb focused, and crucially they land based. So even if we think about triathlon, 2/3 of the disciplines are on land, 1/3 is going to be in the water. But when it comes to swimming and marathon swimming in particular, First of all, I think the key difference is that the body position is completely different. So we move from this bipedal upright position into a horizontal, or what we call in scientific or anatomical terms, prone position. So you face down in the water. And probably the most crucial aspect is that we're actually surrounded and immersed by water, sometimes for hours at a time if we're thinking about those long distance swims. And that environment has some really important physiological effects on how your heart functions, how you breathe, how you thermoregulate, and also how blood is distributed around the body. And so all of those things combined together has got implications for performance as well.
So that brings me, I guess, to the most important conversations for today, is the research that you're now part of related to SIPE, or swimming-induced pulmonary edema.
Yeah.
And you mentioned about how body position and being in the water, how that changes the way the body responds within an exercise environment.
Definitely.
Without making it too complicated, swimmers have heard this term SIPE. Can you tell us a little bit more about what SIPE is?
Yeah, sure. So SIPE, as an acronym or abbreviation, stands for swimming-induced pulmonary edema. And I guess we use the North American spelling of edema, which begins with an E, as opposed to the Australian British spelling, which has an O tacked on the front of it. So the swimming-induced pulmonary edema is essentially a condition or a diagnosis whereby we have fluid, so pulmonary edema, on the lungs. And contrary to what you might think, it's not primarily caused by water that's going into the lungs from swallowing or from breathing in or aspirating it in. What actually happens is that this fluid is leaking out of those tiny little blood vessels or capillaries that we have surrounding the lung tissue. That fluid then goes back into the lungs where it's not supposed to be. And we think that this is driven by a change in pressure inside the pulmonary sort of blood vessels. And as you can imagine, that having all this fluid on the lungs is going to make it really hard for somebody to breathe. That can be really frightening, really disconcerting for somebody who might be swimming. Often it will come on quite quickly, and some people might not be very prepared for that, but they might otherwise be really fit and capable of doing the swim. So essentially what we think that SIPE is, it's a pathological or pathophysiological reaction to a very certain set of environmental conditions.
So why swimming then? Why is it not these other activities? Is it related to the actual environment? What are the other risk factors that potentially might lead to this condition?
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, this prone body position and this water immersion is going to really fundamentally change your cardiac and pulmonary or respiratory physiology. What we have is the hydrostatic effect of the water. So when you're in the water, the pressure of being in that water that it's exerting on your body is actually going to shift blood away from your legs, so your periphery, and it's going to centralize blood volume. So it's going to take most of your blood in your body and kind of push it towards your thoracic chest cavity. And then this has further implications on venous return. So I know I'm using all these big sort of scientific terms, but venous return is essentially how much blood is coming back from your body into your heart so that it can be pumped around the body again. And this is going to increase something called cardiac preload, and that's essentially how much stretch there is on the muscle of the heart before it contracts again. And so when this is happening, and this normally happens when we're immersed in water, and this should happen, but if we have an example whereby this hydrostatic pressure of the water is exerting, and we have some other risk factors, so we have this accumulative effect of what's happening all at the same time. We've got immersion shift into the chest cavity. We've got maybe cold water as well. So being in cooler water environments can cause vasoconstriction or squeezing of the blood vessels in and around the periphery, the sort of the skin. And that's going to do the same thing, is going to push blood back towards the middle of the body. And all of that is going to sort of change the demand of blood flow in the arteries or the tubes of the body. And what we think in some people is that the combination of all of these things, all of this pressure in the lung, is just enough for fluid to be forced back. And where's that fluid coming from? It's coming from the blood. It's going to be forced back into the air spaces. And so if we think about it in a very simple term or an analogy, it might be sort of a temporary pressure overload in the plumbing system, I guess, of the lungs.
My next question then is, and you may not have the answer for us at the moment, why doesn't it affect everyone in the same way?
That's a great question. We do know that on basis, or sort of on general understanding of the research that we do have and the evidence that we do have, that there are a number of individual level risk factors, so cold water being one. Another risk factor that some people have for developing this condition is swimming hard early, so maybe not having an optimal pacing strategy. So it's driven by exertion. Sometimes we see it more when people are immersed for long periods of time, so the longer you're in the water, the more opportunity there is for all of these physiological changes to happen. And one of the crucial risk factors is actually having had an episode or a diagnosis of SIPE before. We also think that wearing a wetsuit can contribute to SIPE, and I guess in the case of a channel swim crossing, there's rules against wearing wetsuits, but those tight full body swimsuits, maybe those are also contributing factors as well. We also think that people who have high blood pressure, so existing cardiovascular conditions like hypertension, they can also be at a higher risk. And we also think that there might be a greater proportion of women who present with SIPE. So whether or not the female sex is a risk factor, we're still trying to better understand that. Ultimately, it's really important to understand that it's multifactorial. There's no single one risk factor or modifier that's sufficient on its own. And what we don't really know is why some swimmers will get this condition regardless of what the risk factors are and why some don't. That's probably one of the biggest things that remains poorly understood. There's the individual susceptibility. Why does some person who has a little bit of fluid on their lungs get really unwell? Why does another swimmer who has fluid on their lungs, also from being immersed, not get the same response? And so because we have these gaps in our knowledge, we don't really have very robust evidence-based prevention strategies just beyond some general risk reduction. There are some studies from North America and also Europe, so we've got some really good research that's come out of Scandinavia from some endurance swims that they do there. And it's actually telling us that the risk of SIPE is actually quite low. So without fear-mongering and telling everybody that they're probably going to get SIPE, no, that's not the case. It's very low. Some studies are reporting between 0.1 to 1.8% of people in an event might have some degree of SIPE, whether that's mild or transient is sort of not really clear yet. And that might increase to around 3% if we're in high stress situations or cold water environments as well. So I guess the key thing here is SIPE is not common, so it's quite rare. The incidence is low. We also think that because there's a cluster of symptoms that people get, which presents in a very different way for some people, that it might be underdiagnosed. And so we're still doing some research to try and better understand it. As always, I am speaking in general terms, and so every individual is going to have their own experience. And obviously this is a medical condition that gets diagnosed by a medical individual. And so that's not something that we can just do based on from what we know from research and practice as well.
Thanks. So it sounds like there's a lot more research needs to be done to truly understand. You've indicated that there are a lot of signs and symptoms which might present, even though it affects a very small proportion of swimmers. What are some of those signs and symptoms that the swimmers might recognise, or potentially the support crews might be able to recognise to ensure the safety of the swimmer?
Yeah, so the biggest red flag is probably breathlessness or difficulty with breathing that feels out of proportion for the effort that swimmer is putting in. If your swimmer suddenly can't catch their breath, or they're coughing repeatedly, maybe they feel a little bit of chest tightness or discomfort in the chest, or they can hear sort of rasping when they're breathing, that's not something that a swimmer should be pushing through. That might indicate that something's not quite right. And so I think support crews are really important for swimmers in this context. And so some of the signs that crews should be on the lookout for, as well as swimmers, maybe a sudden breathlessness. So like I said before, it can come on quite suddenly for some people. Persistent coughing that doesn't necessarily go away. If they have something called hemoptysis, which is a big fancy word to saying they're coughing up blood. So if the sort of spit or saliva or sputum that person's coughing up is frothy and maybe tinged with a bit of pink, that could be indicative that something's not quite right. Maybe they're having trouble with full sentences when they stop at their feeds, or they can't really speak very clearly. Or if they have some, really visible distress, then it's time to act, and it's time to act pretty quick.
I guess that leads me on to hypothermia, because
Yeah.
I think some of those signs and symptoms can be quite similar. And I guess initially there was a conversation around whether hypothermia was the precursor to SIPE. Potentially, hypothermia, though, itself is misunderstood in open water swimming. So, first, if you could give us a bit of an idea about what is actually happening as the body temperature drops physiologically.
Yeah, so I guess humans are very good at regulating their body temperature. So normal core temperature is in and around 37 degrees Celsius. And how we regulate our temperature is through what we call conductive or convective heat loss. So that's either we lose heat to our surrounding environment with direct contact, or we lose heat because there's movement of the environment around us. So that's conductive and convective. So when you're in the water, it's actually going to conduct heat away from your body about 25 times faster than what air does. So the important message here is that the water temperature doesn't actually have to feel cold to still be a stress on the body. And even if the temperature feels fine, we know that typically in summer for a Rottnest crossing, the temperature is going to be around 22 degrees Celsius. So that's not cold by any means or description, but somebody is going to still be losing heat the entire time by just being immersed in that water. And so there are some things that we can do to counteract that heat loss. Obviously, the first one is for the body generates its own heat through the lean muscle, skeletal muscle actually exercising or swimming. And one of the other strategies is actually being well insulated. So body composition, particularly body fat in marathon swimming, is not cheating. It's actually really helpful and really useful for insulating against that conductive or heat loss. But regardless of that, if you're going to be swimming for a long time, we're thinking of our solo swimmers in particular, you can still get cold, because as you start getting more fatigued towards the end, the likelihood that the conditions are starting to change, that sea breeze is swinging in, it's going to become harder and harder and harder. Your ability to produce heat is also going to decline. And eventually, if a person is in a situation where their ability to generate heat is exceeded by the loss that they're experiencing, then this is gradually going to reduce core temperature down and lead to hypothermia. So the important thing here is mild hypothermia is somewhere where the core temp drops to around 36 degrees Celsius. And hypothermia, sort of by definition or by diagnosis, sets in when you're below 35. Another important point, we talked about convective heat loss, so that's losing heat to your environment when it's moving. It's not just water temperature we need to be aware of. As we all know, in Perth, the windy city, when you're on your feed stops, when you're getting in and out of the water, so this one's particularly important for those people in teams or duos, that can also increase your risk of losing heat. So that risk shouldn't be underestimated. Even when, we're in the sunniest capital, Perth, and the sun is shining and it's a warm day, that wind can still be something that is important to recognize.
I agree. A lot of swimmers maybe don't always appreciate that impact and the importance of trying to get yourself dry and out of the wind when you do go through those transition phases with your team and with your duo, such that you can actually maintain body temperatures is very important. What happens to swimmers then? What can be noticeable from the boat, from the paddler, maybe potentially from the swimmer themselves, so we can protect the swimmer in this environment?
Yeah, so like we talked about those different signs for SIPE, one of the first signs that a swimmer might be hypothermic is actually a reduction in coordination and maybe their decision making as well. We know that the brain itself is really sensitive to cooling, much more so than the body. So a swimmer can actually feel okay, and they might say that they're okay, despite all of these cognitive effects or these changes that are happening in the brain that are really important warning signals that something might not be quite right. A swimmer is going to tell you likely that they're fine. And the tricky part here isn't that the swimmer's ignoring the warning sign, it's that their own ability to recognize that those signs are impaired before they actually realize it. And so that's why having a really attentive, educated and informed crew is necessary. So the crew always has your back, and they are your first and your only safety net. So some of the things to look out for, those warning signs, that something might not be quite right in and around someone who might be hypothermic or suspected to be hypothermic. They might have some slowed or slurred speech, so they might not be speaking very clearly. They might be confused, their decision making is impaired. You might notice that their stroke rhythm is lost, or maybe they have an asymmetric type stroke. Maybe they are having struggled to coordinate when they're stopping on their feeds. Importantly, I think shivering. We all think that when someone gets cold, they shiver, yes, but it's less common when we think about hypothermic in water-based environments, and it's probably one of the really late signs that a swimmer is cold. So it's not one of the primary ones to look out for.
Just to sort of summarize what you've said there, I talk about the umbles. So the grumbles, the fumbles, mumbles, and stumbles. So having a negative outlook, slower reaction time, slurring words, and losing coordination. So all the things you've just mentioned.
Yeah.
I think that also then says the communication with the paddler, especially having those conversations with the swimmer, those feeding times, allows that picture to be coloured as we go through, just to see how that swimmer's progressing.
Yeah.
Hypothermia seems to affect people of all abilities. You and I both have a friend who was winning the swim to Rottnest one year, so at the pointy end of the field, and was pulled out with hypothermia. Yeah. He went back again and won the race later. So it's not just your experience which will protect you. I'm just wondering if you might be able to explain why that might occur.
Yeah, I think experience or being an experienced swimmer doesn't make you immune to getting cold or having hypothermia, but I think maybe it does make you a bit better at managing or understanding the risks. And regardless of your experience, I think complacency in any way, shape, or form is never a good idea when embarking on a marathon swim. It's one of those things that's very challenging for everybody involved, and things can potentially go wrong pretty quickly. So being prepared for that is always important. When we think about those experienced swimmers, I think sometimes maybe they can underestimate the accumulative effects of cooling over time. And this is particularly true if maybe early on in the swim, the conditions feel really manageable. So they might be going really well, having a great time. And then, as I mentioned before, when that sea breeze potentially kicks in the afternoon and the conditions change, and now you've got fatigue on top of you, maybe 15, 16, 17 Ks into that 20 K swim, then your ability to produce heat is going to be reduced regardless of your experience level. So I think being aware is probably one of the best strategies to manage or mitigate that risk. And then on that point, I think that you made about your support crew, having a really close support crew that has your back and knows you and can understand you and your different personalities that you might experience across the 20K crossing is really important for managing your safety. So having those, maybe tough conversations early on can perhaps be really useful even for those experienced swimmers.
Lastly, in the space of hypothermia, post-swim, once the swimmer gets out of the water, they've finished the event, what are some of the things we need to consider that swimmers, they're very excited, they've finished the race, they want to go to the pub, they want to celebrate with their team. But what do they need to consider post-race?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of a paradox, isn't it? You get to the beach, you think it's all over, I've made it. But the crucial thing is that the risk for hypothermia is not quite over just yet. And so there's this phenomenon or this observation that we sometimes see called afterdrop. And as the name suggests, it's when a swimmer's core temperature can actually continue to fall even after they've left that water environment. And so even when a swimmer is no longer in the water, they've come out of the water, they no longer have that what we call vasoconstriction of all the peripheral arteries in the body. So what starts to happen is that those blood vessels start to dilate. So that means all of that cool blood that's now coming back from the skin, because that skin's been immersed in that cool environment for such a long period of time, that actually circulates back to the core, and that's what can start cooling a swimmer down. And if we now combine this with being out in the wind, having all that evaporation of that water that's now on your skin because you're not yet dry, we can sometimes see core temperature drop even up to 30 minutes after somebody has exited the water. And so I think what good post-swim management looks like, there's some priorities that you and your crew need to think about. The first one is making sure that you get your swimmer out of the wind if it is a windy day on the island. Make sure that you dry the skin so that we avoid that evaporation or that convective cooling. And then make sure that you insulate them and then rewarm them gradually. Some of the common errors that we sometimes see are just leaving the swimmer alone, not drying them off. Maybe you see that they might be starting to feel cold, or they say that they're starting to feel cold and you just wrap them in some towels or some blankets without drying them off first. One of the key ones is thinking that we need to get you in a hot shower pretty quick. Sometimes a hot shower can actually worsen after drop because it further dilates those blood vessels. And so as a support crew, keeping an eye on your swimmer, making sure they're not left alone after the swim is important as well. And I think your role does continue even after the swimmer has finished.
It sounds like some sound advice in terms of what to do or how to identify hypothermia and SIPE. Just moving into a different direction, but still in terms of how the body responds in open water. And although the conversations we've had so far have typically been around open water swimming as a sport, there are others that use the ocean in a swimming sense, and one of those is through snorkeling and diving. At the end of last year, you took a team over to the Great Barrier Reef and you were asked to look at what are the physiological responses to snorkeling and diving. I'm just wondering, first of all, what sparked that project?
Yeah, well, I promise it wasn't just a holiday, but no, very fortunate to be able to do it. And it actually stemmed from the work that we've been doing with the Rottnest Channel Swim, trying to better understand what SIPE is, what it might look like, how we might be able to better diagnose it. And so there was a call for some funding from the Australian Diving Safety Foundation, and they were really supportive of us going over to the Great Barrier Reef to try and better understand what is the incidence of not necessarily swimming-induced pulmonary edema, but we call it immersion pulmonary edema because the person is immersed when they are snorkeling or diving in a recreational context. So there's millions of visitors to the Great Barrier Reef. It's a beautiful place every year, and they still have some people who do get pretty unwell from being in the water. And so what's interesting about understanding these types of activities is that, quite similar to swimming, the body is responding to some of those same, I guess, environmental stresses. So they're immersed in the water. Temperature of the water probably on the Great Barrier Reef is not necessarily a factor, but certainly wind can be, and so that convective heat loss might be an issue for some. Breathing against pressure by using a regulator if you're diving, or using a snorkel if you're snorkeling. And we also still get some of those same changes in blood flow distribution, particularly if maybe they're not wearing a very well-fitted wetsuit, because the wetsuits that they have are just for hire, they're not individual wetsuits. And so all of this together can potentially play a role in somebody presenting with immersion pulmonary edema. And that might be particularly true. We think that exertion or activity is one of the factors that drives this particular condition. For somebody who's never done snorkeling before or who's never done diving before, the level of exertion might be much more than somebody who's familiar with that particular activity. So if we link it back to the work that we've been involved in for SIPE with marathon swimming, even though they're different aquatic activities, I think it shows us that the lungs, and we think maybe even the heart as well, is pretty important in terms of immersion. So when you combine all of these things, you put some exertion on top of it, whether it's marathon swimming or it's snorkeling for the first time, stacking up those stresses one on top of the other can perhaps lead to some of these pulmonary symptoms that present in people that might have otherwise healthy heart and healthy lungs. So that's some of the things that we're trying to better understand and tease out.
Oh, that sounds like it was a very interesting and enjoyable project or trip to the Great Barrier Reef.
It was amazing.
Once you've actually completed your analysis, it'd be really nice to have someone from the team to come back on and discuss. But I do think it's really important that we can see across all different types of swimming and that engagement in that open water, that we do still need to think about the health and safety of people.
Yeah, ultimately what we're trying to do is make being in the water, whether you're swimming or you're snorkeling or you're diving, safer and more enjoyable, because we just want people to keep doing it for as long as possible.
Fantastic. Another little topic one of our earlier guests brought up, the variations between males and females. It's potentially an area that is underrepresented from a research perspective, underrepresented, especially in endurance-based sports. When we're looking at the female physiology, and especially in open water swimming, what are some of the things that we really need to consider?
Yeah, this is an area that I'm hugely interested in as well, also from a cardiovascular physiological perspective too, but also across exercise physiology and science and sports medicine. We do know that females are underrepresented. So for every two males athletes that participate in research, we have the equivalent of one female athlete who is also studied. One of the other things that has been a bit of a barrier to understanding that sex-specific or female-specific response, regardless of whether it's marathon swimming or any other physical activity, is that women, when they're in reproductive age, have the effect of endocrine hormones through a menstrual cycle. So those key hormones that we're thinking about are estrogen and progesterone. And, you know, some women or some female athletes might also choose to use some form of hormonal contraceptive, and that will downregulate those sort of endogenous, those sort of hormones that you have circulating around in your body. And so we think that these hormones might have an effect on some of the other systems in the body, not just your reproductive organs. And so that's sort of stemmed a hypothesis that perhaps females might respond differently to exercise because of these hormones, and the receptors of these hormones are on tissues all around the body. So we've got estrogen receptors on cardiac tissue, for example. And so what effect does that have on the function of the heart, and what implications does that have for performance or training?
That makes a lot of sense, and I think it certainly opens up the opportunity for greater conversation around this. As you said, there's potential differences in the cardiovascular response. Thermoregulatory responses can be quite different as well. And that in itself might actually fluctuate throughout the menstrual cycle. We're really only scratching the surface on this topic. If we were to sort of dedicate this conversation a bit further, where would you like to see it explored? What areas do you think are really important that we need to consider within this open water community?
Yeah, I think we want more and more people to be involved in events, and you know, what we don't need is another barrier for participation for people. And if somebody thinks or feels that perhaps their period or how they feel when they have their period might be a barrier to them doing physical activity, then that's something that we need to be aware of. And I think that's true as scientists, as coaches, as partners, as people who support, you know, athletes or who support our swimmers. But what's missing, I think, is obviously more broadly, we probably need more research that is focused on females specifically. And we also need more research that really accounts for what those potential hormonal effects might be. The current evidence or the current thinking that we have from the studies that are coming out, and they're coming out rapid fire because there's a lot of people who are really interested in this particular topic, is that on aggregate, so what we do in science is we get a whole group of people, we measure them, we get a particular output, and then we average all of their results together. On average, when we take a group of female athletes, we typically don't see any impacts of these hormones on some key markers of performance. What that doesn't mean is that there isn't a potential individual response. So one person is going to have one experience that might be completely different to another person. And so I think, as always, we should be treating our athletes as individuals, regardless of what their sex or gender might be, and also providing a degree of empathy and support. So if we're thinking, you know, my athlete says that they don't feel great when they're on their period or on, you know, day 1 or day 2 of their period, what does that actually mean? You know, so we know that for some women they feel okay, some don't, some push through, some prefer not to. And so that individual response, I think, is really important. What's missing, as in sort of the research that we still need, is we kind of, I guess, maybe forget about women when they move through their reproductive lifespan towards menopause. And again, we have another period of time where there's a lot of change. So now all of these endocrine hormones like estrogen and progesterone start fluctuating again in and around what we call perimenopause, so the period of time before somebody experiences menopause. And so that also has implications potentially for how somebody feels and how somebody performs. And that's typically going to happen in and around middle age for a lot of female athletes, in and around the time that they want to be involved in marathon swimming and want to be competitive. So I think that the response for the perimenopausal female athletes transitioning into menopause is probably an area that deserves a bit of attention as well.
I think that's a really relatable experience for a lot of swimmers.
Yeah.
And I think as a community might have educated younger people around the changes through puberty. But as you indicate, the second half of our life, that part is an area that certainly does require a bit more attention and a bit more conversation to understand the variability between individuals.
Yeah, absolutely. And a bit more evidence as well to inform some of those decisions too.
So from today, if swimmers remember just one thing about heart and lung stress in a marathon swimming, what do you think that should be?
Let's not forget that humans are very robust and very physiologically resilient. Most people are going to be absolutely fine. They are going to respond beautifully to their training. They're going to have a successful crossing. They're going to enjoy the celebrations with their crew at the end. But when the heart and the lungs or your temperature regulation start sending those warning signals, I think those signals deserve a bit of respect and attention. So being aware that normal physiology and normal response to exercise is normal, but sometimes if you're in a context or an environment that might not be normal for you, that might result in something that is worthy of attention. And it's not a sign of not being prepared or being weak or unfit. I think it's just a situational context more so than anything else.
What do you wish more swimmers and support crews understood? So it's the beach on race morning, they're ready to go. From your experience, not just as the scientist, but as the swimmer, that you can go back and go, well, I wish I knew these things. What do you wish that they had a bit more understanding of?
Yeah, I think a good message is that open water swimming and marathon swimming is not just about your fitness. It's not just about your preparation. All of those things are really important. So being prepared and having a degree of fitness to be able to do it. But I think the environment is very specific, and I think crews and swimmers should not underestimate the impacts of that environment. So that would probably be my take home for most people.
Wonderful. And my last couple of questions then, and this is one for everyone. What's your favourite swimming session?
It's been a while since I've been in the pool, so no judgment there. Favorite? Hard to say. Memorable, I could probably give you. I think I have a couple. So the first one is probably back in the day in one of your squads, Grant. I remember it was an early morning swim, and before we knew it, there was a big cage that was wheeled out to the pool deck, and it had shoes in it. So it had all of these old sneakers, and everybody had to put on a pair of sneakers and swim. And I thought, what on earth is happening here? I thought I was probably going to drown, but it was memorable because it was so fun. So I definitely remember that particular session. Whether it was my favorite or not, probably not. Memorable. And then when I was training for Roto, I think probably one of the more memorable sessions, because it felt like I'd accomplished something quite profound, was the classic 100-100 set in the pool. A lot of people think it's boring. It probably is boring, but it was just something where I felt really accomplished, having reached that milestone and done 100 100s in a swimming pool in one session. And so that one was probably memorable as well.
That is a big session, and a lot of people use it. And it is, I've set a goal, I've achieved it, and I can build confidence from that. So finally, is there anything else that we might not have covered today, or you might want to sort of add a little bit more detail to before we finish up?
I think that marathon swimming can be a really incredible and really empowering sport. At least it was for me. I achieved some things that I didn't know that I was physically, mentally, or emotionally capable of achieving. I still think it's important to be aware of the risks. It doesn't make it more dangerous. It's not trying to, as I said, fearmonger anybody into not wanting to do a swim. But I think it just makes it safer when everybody is really well prepared.
Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your insights today. I'm sure what you've presented and what we've discussed, I think, will be well received by the open water swimmers out there today.
Thanks for having me.
No worries. Talk again soon.
Cool. Thanks, Grant.
That brings us to the end of today's episode. A huge thanks again to Dr. Angela Spence for sharing not just her scientific expertise, but also her lived experiences as a marathon swimmer, a support crew member, and someone who understands this sport from every angle. If you found this conversation helpful, please take a moment to follow the show, leave a rating or review, and share this episode with someone in your squad or support crew. Anyone who you think would benefit from understanding more about the heart, lungs, and how the body responds in open water. And if you're enjoying these deeper dives into the science and art of open water swimming, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. You can also connect with me on social media or reach out if there's a topic or guest you'd love to hear on the show. Thanks for listening, and as always, see you in the water.